In this lesson, we will use particular to create particles for our scene. Okay, so we're right here where we left off, and I want to add some particles now to my scene to really help sell the look that things are moving around and that this isn't just a static kind of shot of just zooming into this area here where we see the cabin. So I'm going to add some particles, and I'm going to be using particular because it is a great particle generator when you're using a 3D camera. The particles really interact realistically with your camera. Now you could go in and fake some particles with a particle generator that comes in After Effects like CC Particle World, but I'm going to be using particular for this instance of my particles. So I'm just going to go over here to my Effects and Presets panel as I have that up and type in particular. And that's going to come up there at the bottom. And now to add this effect, I'm just going to drop it onto a solid. So we need to add a solid to our timeline. I'm just going to go up here to Layer, make sure I'm selected inside of my composition window. And I'll say OK to that. Now I'm just going to move this right beneath my camera, but on top of all of my other layers. And we'll add the particular effect to our solid. And as we're starting out right there, this is what we get. We kind of just get this little clump of particles right in the middle there. So let's start messing with some of these options over here and these properties to make it look like we kind of have some particles just floating in from that left side, and also to just reinforce that idea we talked about in the last lesson of kind of having a slight breeze from the left side of our scene. So I want to start out with the emitter option, which is this one right there. And this is just going to kind of say where those particles are coming from. So I'm going to move over here to the position of the emitter, and let's just move this a little farther to the left. Now I'm not going to move it all the way off my scene, but I'm just going to move it a little bit further in this direction. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at some of these other options we have under the emitter. The first one I want to take a look at is my velocity, and that's just going to say how fast those particles are traveling. And for now, 100 is going to be okay because I haven't changed enough of the other settings to really be able to tell how fast I want them to go. But I do know that I don't want my particles to be really randomly affected, so I'm just going to turn that randomness down to 0. And I'm also going to turn down the velocity from motion to 0 as well. And I can just type that in there if I don't want to drag that. Now, something that I want to be able to do is to see my particles kind of generating all across my 3D space. So I need to choose a different kind of emitter for that. So I'm going to come up here to emitter type and change this to a box emitter. And it doesn't really look like it made a huge difference yet, but it will. One of the things that changed in these settings is that now we get these emitter size options. So now I can start to kind of drag these, and I get a more, just a bigger depth as far as how far backwards in space my particles look like they're coming from. So I'm going to create a lot of depth in this scene with my particles, and I want a lot of particles to be generating really close to the camera, and then I want some of them to be really far away. So we see that as we drag out that Z size there, we get some really close here and then some really far back there in the background. So it's just kind of going to look like maybe some pollen or something is sort of floating through that breeze. So somewhere right in here around 2700 is a good value for the emitter Z size. Now let's get the Y size cranked up there, so we're kind of pushing those further apart, and probably somewhere right in there around 1300 is good. And then I'm also going to push the Z emitter size up pretty considerably because I want them to be really far distributed across my whole scene there. And we can go in and turn that up more if we need to. I'm going to leave it there at about 3500 for now. And one other thing I'm going to do is go down here to the emission extras right under this option there to the random seed, and I'm just going to crank that up. I'm not really intent on any particular value there, but that's just going to give me a different seed, so it's going to just start the particles at a different point than they normally would at the default. So that's just something I like to tweak whenever I'm first starting a project with really any particle generator that gives me the option to change that default value. Okay, so let's move on to particle, which is our next value we can tweak right there. And I'm just going to toggle back up that emitter option so that we keep this panel a little bit easier to read. So my particle life right now is at 3 seconds. And let's just see what happens if we start to crank that up. For now, we don't really see a big change because we haven't changed anything to do with the physics of our scene, or the life of our actual particles. So we may go in and change that in a moment, but for now, I'm just going to leave that at this 6.8 value. So I'm pretty happy with this round kind of look that I have for my particles right now, and I'm probably going to go back and make them a little bit smaller in a moment, but for now I'm going to leave them at this size just so it's easier for me to see as I'm tweaking the options. One of the things I do want to change while we're here in this particle setting is the opacity, and I'm going to go to this option right here, opacity over life. So we can toggle that down, and I see that I have kind of this graph here. And what this is saying is that this is the level of opacity here, how high this red value gets, and then this is the birth here at the beginning and the death of our particles. So when a particle is born, if I want it to be transparent, I'm going to have this just start coming straight out of the bottom there. And then when I want my particles to die, if I want them to just quickly disappear, I would leave this at a higher opacity. But I really want them to kind of fade on and then fade off so they just feel really natural. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of draw a shape that looks something like this. And you see that you can get these presets over here on the side as well. So we could kind of preset it to this bell curve look, and then maybe go in and just tweak that if you don't ever want them to get to a full 100% opacity. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And now that we've changed that opacity over life, it's probably going to be a little bit easier for us to see what it looks like when we change the life of those particles. So now we see that as we kind of change the amount of time that those particles are alive for, we get a little bit of a different look since we've tweaked that opacity value. So let's just turn this to somewhere right around 5 seconds for the life of our particles. Okay, so now let's go down to the next option, which is going to be physics. I'm going to skip the shading. We're just going to go to physics, and this is where we're going to be able to tweak that wind that we were talking about before. So right now our gravity is at 0, which we're going to leave that, and the physics model that we're using is air, which is great since we're going to be working with the wind. Now let's drop down this air option right there and start to change some of these values. So as I said before, I don't want my particles to have a big random look to them where they're kind of floating around. So I'm going to turn off the spin frequency and the fade in spin right there. I'm going to turn that all the way down to 0 so there's no spin happening with our particles. But I do want to turn up the X wind. So if I turn this here to a positive value, we see we start to move those particles to the right, just like we were saying we wanted to add the wind. So I'm going to maybe not go quite that far, maybe somewhere right around 210 right in there. So let's go ahead and watch a RAM preview now just to see kind of some of these options that we've tweaked and what our particles are looking like. So I'm going to hit the 0 key on my keyboard. And already those particles are looking pretty good. We really kind of get the sense that there's maybe a lot of pollen or some kind of tree in the area that's kind of letting off this sort of a particle into our air. Okay, so really quickly, I'm going to go back up to my particle options, and we're going to turn the size of our particle down because, as we saw, those particles are pretty big, and I don't want them to be quite so prominent. They're just a little bit of an accent. So let's turn the size of our particle down to maybe like a 3. So they're just going to be really small. There's quite a big bit of difference between a 3 and a 5, which you might not think would give you that much of a difference, but some of these particles now are just really 1 pixel, the ones that are really far away. So you can really set this to whatever you want. I'm going to leave mine at 3. Now, the last thing that I want to pay attention to is that I want to have motion blur on for these particles, because I don't want them to feel like they're just kind of jittering across my screen. So to do that, all I have to do is turn on the motion blur switch for the solid that I applied particular to, and then also turn on motion blur for my scene. We see that we get just a little bit of blur on those particles now. And you can go back in and maybe do another RAM preview and tweak the velocity of that if you feel like it's going a little bit too fast. But for now, I think that these particles look pretty good, and really the only thing that is left to change is maybe if you're not happy with them kind of not having any particles at the beginning, you want it to look like you kind of have particles already there, you can just grab this layer and move it backwards in your timeline and then drag the end of your particles out so that you already have them in your scene the whole time. Okay, so in this lesson we learned that particles are a great way to add some life to a very still image and how to tweak those particles to create the illusion of wind in our atmosphere.